Good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Husey, and on behalf of the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Studies and our partners NDIA and ROA, I want to thank you for being here. This and our next in our series of seminars on nuclear deterrence, missile defense, arms control, defense policy, and proliferation. Today, we are honored to have Brad Roberts from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, but let me, before I introduce Brad, welcome our embassy staff that are here, and my friend Drew Walters, who's here from the House Armed Services Committee, and also our sponsors and supporters, and welcome also to Joe Connell, who is with the Strategic Deterrent Coalition, or is having a triad event next May in Barksdale. So you put that on your kind of long-term calendars, probably be the first week. Our triad event in September on the 28th, we're not booked, but we do have 170 people who have already signed up, but I have some room for people that are friends and supporters that if you need to attend, please let me know. Tomorrow we are featuring our space breakfast with Ellen Polakowski, and she will be introduced by Congressman Mike Rogers. And then on July 20th, we have Ron Lehman, formerly with Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and he will be speaking at the Capitol Hill Club. 25th is Senator Donnelly from Indiana, ranking member of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, the Senate Armed Services Committee. Then on the 28th, we have Mike Rogers, who will talk about prospects for conference with the Senate Armed Services Committee. And then on the 3rd of August, we have General Silva, who is the number 2 of the chairman, vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then to end the summer before the August recess, Uzi Rubin will lay out the Iranian and North Korean ballistic missile threats to this country and their cooperative work, including the areas of cooperation with China, Russia, and Pakistan. He gave a brief to the South Korean government, which he has shared with us, which is pretty extraordinary given what you've seen in the news. And so with that, if you have any questions, Nikki is here and I'm here if you need to sign up for any of these events. With that, I want to welcome Dr. Brad Roberts here, who is the director of the Center for Global Security Research. And from April 2009 to March 2013, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, and he served as the Policy Director of the administration's Nuclear Posture Review and Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and had lead responsibility for their implementation. And then from September 2013 to December 2014, he was a consulting professor and William Perry Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. And one of the key reasons why he's here today is his book entitled The Case for U.S. Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century that came out in November 2015, laid out not just the case for strategic nuclear modernization, but more importantly, I think, was his understanding of the Russian strategy of nuclear deterrence and, in fact, using nuclear weapons in a conflict, as Mayor Daley said, about voting early and often. And I've asked Brad to come out here and update, and he chose an interesting title about the red and blue theories of nuclear victory. And so he's going to talk to us about that. And so with that, Brad, on behalf of General Deptula, our Dean of the Mitchell Institute, and our staff here at AFA, I want to thank you for coming all the way from California to talk with us. So would you give a warm welcome to our friend, Dr. Brad Roberts.
Thank you, Peter. Okay. Not too warm, thank you. It's already plenty warm. You know, in California, ties are illegal. And it's always a test to come back to D.C. in the summer and dress for the occasion. I'd like to thank Peter for this opportunity and for hosting this discussion, and indeed thank Peter and the Mitchell Institute for all you do to help sustain, renew, reinvigorate, and sustain leadership focus on nuclear deterrence. It wasn't all that long ago that you couldn't find that half of the room comprising everybody who was interested in nuclear deterrence issues in Washington, D.C. And the fact that the community keeps growing and the average age keeps reducing are very encouraging signs of a shift in our political orientation to these difficult questions. Thank you for the opportunity to set out some arguments about theories of victory, red and blue. I'd like to be clear that I'm speaking for myself. I'm not here representing the views of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory or the Department of Energy. And I am drawing on arguments in the book, which I hope many of you have seen, which has been out a couple of years and stimulated a lot of strong debate. The reviewers tend to be from the two camps that either love or hate nuclear weapons, and you wonder if either of them really read the book. And the best reviews for the book have come from people who feel they want to be in the middle and don't really know where it is, because mostly the debate is dominated by the two extremes. In my experience in the Department of Defense and in trying to sustain and facilitate U.S. leadership for nuclear deterrence, I went into the administration from the experience with the Strategic Posture Commission, which had tried to set out in 2008 and 9 a bipartisan approach to nuclear strategy. And the Obama administration attempted to govern on the basis of the recommendations of the Strategic Posture Commission. And very often we found that there was no middle politically on which to stand when it came to nuclear deterrence questions. And very, very rarely was there sustained leadership focus despite the commitment to it from a number of high-level sources. And as I worked with this context, a number of issues leapt out at me as requiring further, where there was disagreement inside the community about the nature of the problem we face and the nature of the solution. So I began a body of work in the Pentagon and then sustained it in the unclassified form while at Stanford, and indeed it's a focus of a lot of the work of the Center for Global Security Research. But to understand that problem that's hidden in the Daily Intelligence Briefing Book. The Daily Intelligence Briefing Book, of course, brings the latest slate of unwelcome news about what adversaries have done. My book read nuclear and missile defense topics, but didn't bring the why. Didn't really explain what it was that these capabilities were being brought together to do. What was the driving set of concepts behind the capabilities? I subscribe to the view reflected in the nuclear employment guidance of the Obama administration that the risks of global nuclear war have gone down substantially over the last 3 decades, but the risk of nuclear attack on the United States or our allies has increased, and that this is not the only pathway to possible U.S. nuclear employment, that there are means other than nuclear means to put at risk the vital interests of the United States or its allies. And that guidance was premised on presidential guidance that said we should take seriously the possibility that deterrence would fail, and that the president needed options to respond to that failure and to restore deterrence. But what would that failure look like, and what would the options be that we would want to have available to the president in that moment? To get into that, to answer those questions, required better understanding the ways in which our potential adversaries have gone to school on us. You're all familiar with Bob Work's statement of 2015 or 2016, that in the period since 9/11, while we've been focused on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism as our main military problem, a variety of actors have gone to school on us, studied our way of war, tried to understand our strengths and circumvent them, and try to understand our weaknesses and exploit them. I actually think the going to school part started earlier. You may recall the statement attributed to Indian Army Chief of Staff K. Sundarji in 1992. He was asked, what was the lesson of the Persian Gulf War? This was a Defense Nuclear Agency conference in Richmond, Virginia. What was the lesson of the Persian Gulf War? Quote, "Don't mess with America without nukes." Interesting formulation. The first country apparently to be directly seized with this question in a big way was China. China looked at the experience of the Persian Gulf War very closely, but considered it an abstract problem. Then came the Taiwan Missile Straits crisis, and most Americans who remember the Straits crisis remember that we dispatched a carrier battle group. What impresses most Chinese who remember that experience is that we started to dispatch a second carrier battle group. That signaled that we were going beyond display of the flag to preparation for war. And if America was prepared for war with China, China had better get ready for war with America. But of course, at that point, military modernization was the fourth of 4 modernizations. So being ready for war with America was a long-term project for China. But it could put its intellectual house in order, which is the project that they launched onto in 1995 and 96. And they came up with a fairly straightforward set of ideas about what would be required to, as they describe it, deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. Each of those words has a consequence for how they've thought about their response. Deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. And the first core concept is that if war with America appears inevitable, go for the fait accompli. Create a conventional set of facts on the ground in Taiwan before the fleet can arrive from Pearl Harbor, a time measured in weeks, and impress America and its allies with the cost of trying to reverse the fait accompli. But if we are prepared to try to reverse the fait accompli, the next step is to try to separate America from its allies, or more precisely, America's allies from America, by scaring them away, making them fearful, and potentially conducting limited attacks on Japan if it chooses to support the American war effort. If, however, that still fails to dissuade the United States from acting, then be prepared with what we have come to call anti-access area denial capabilities to raise the costs and potentially deny us the ability to project power, but certainly to raise the costs. And lastly, of course, if we bring the war to the mainland, to threaten to bring the war to the American mainland by nuclear means. And a basic set of ideas that they set out in the period of the 1990s and that you can read about in the Science of Military Campaigns, or the Science of Military Strategy. And so China launched into this project in the mid-1990s. The Russian military launched into this project just a little bit later. It's not clear that they'd ever really stopped thinking about the problem of war with the United States, but the war in Kosovo certainly brought home the possibility of confrontation with the United States, military confrontation. It brought home to the Russian military America's success in implementing the Ogarkov vision of the future of war, reconnaissance strike complexes. Here we were fighting a war without barely putting a boot on the ground, bombing a former Soviet ally, and winning. And so the Russian military began to think about the same set of challenges. And indeed, there are Russian military thought articles. That's the Journal of the Russian Joint Staff, General Staff, Military Thought. There are articles that talk about, quote, deterring and defeating a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. The same basic catechism. Why? Because it's the same problem set they have. And the ideas that they've set out in this direction are not strikingly different from China's ideas. The same basic set of problems. If you think America is going to bring war to Russia, be prepared to create a fait accompli on the ground and present the United States and its allies with an image of the very high cost that would go with trying to reverse the fait accompli. If America and its allies choose to prosecute that conflict, then try to separate allies from the United States, from each other, differentially target NATO countries, sparing some, attacking others, make publics fearful, create pressure on governments to be divided and back down. And if the war comes to the Russian homeland, be prepared to bring the war to the American homeland, and potentially by conventional means, not just nuclear means. And North Korea, ironically, was the last of the three to become seized with this particular problem. It appears that its programs for missiles and nuclear weapons were kicked into high gear in the middle of the 2000s. In 2005 or 6, there are press reports that the North Koreans gained, through cyber means, access to top secret war plans in Seoul that included the possibility of setting regime removal in Pyongyang as a wartime objective. And so the business of building, bargaining, pausing, building, bargaining, and pausing that had defined their approach to their missiles and nuclear weapons gave way to what we've seen for the 10 years ever since. No bargaining, no pausing, just building. And the same basic set of ideas have been set out. If war with America appears inevitable, their fait accompli is to seize Seoul and sue for peace. It's not to march all the way to the end of the peninsula. They don't have the means to do that. If war with America and its allies appears inevitable, put Japan in their nuclear crosshairs. How frequently do we hear Kim Jong-un say, if I ever have to use nuclear weapons, my first target is going to be Tokyo? And we Americans hear that and think, well, this reflects the historic bad blood in Northeast Asia. But of course, it's a much more strategic calculus. The conventional defense of the Republic of Korea would be done with armed services, with the military forces of South Korea, American forces on the peninsula, but of course, military forces and assets sitting at, I think, 8 bases in Japan under the United Nations flag, and whose dispatch to the defense of the Republic of Korea requires the approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. In the 1950s, this was a no-brainer because there was no risk. And Kim Jong-un is trying to make sure it's a brainer, that the Japanese Prime Minister has to calculate the possibility that if he supports the war effort, there will be a terrible price to pay. So create the conventional fait accompli, try to separate allies from each other in the United States, be prepared with anti-access area denial strategies, and be prepared to bring the war to the American homeland if it comes to that. And one of the things we have to understand is, can they really believe that their threats are going to be credible in their eyes? What makes them think that their threats are going to be credible and ours are not going to be credible in our own eyes? And there tend to be 2 or 3 different arguments in their literature and political commentary on this. One is the asymmetry of geography. We can't win in Taiwan these days without striking the Chinese mainland. This opens up the credibility of China's threats to attack our homeland. It would be very difficult to protect Lithuania without striking Russian territory. This opens up the credibility of their threats to strike deeply into NATO territory and potentially the American homeland. So that's their first argument, asymmetry of geography. Secondly, asymmetry of stake. And the way this point was made most forcefully to me was by now Major General Yao Yunju, a female PhD in the Chinese People's Liberation Army, who's a longtime interlocutor of mine on nuclear policy and strategy, and an excellent, thoughtful, interesting person. And she said in a debate about escalation in a Taiwan Strait scenario, she said, so let me understand. Your stake, your American stake, your commitment to the people on the island of Taiwan, your commitment to the democratic experiment on Taiwan, your credibility in the eyes of your East Asian allies, your credibility in the eyes of your European allies. Putin's going to be watching. And of course, you Americans, your sense of what you stand for in the world, you always think you're there to do the right thing. All of those will be at stake. What's at stake for China, she asked? Only 2 things. Culminating our effort to recover from the century of humiliation, finally regaining our sovereignty, and frankly, if we lose, the Communist Party is probably going to be thrown out. So whose stake is higher? Ours, she said, our Chinese. You will back down. That summarizes the asymmetry of stake point that they all feel. There's also, I think, the standard interpretation of democracies given by authoritarian leaders, that we are weak, we are led by weak people, that we are easily divided, that we are slow to act, and when we act, we choose the least risky course. And we can be made to be sufficiently fearful, particularly in our moment of economic weakness and political paralysis, to simply back down and not defend our interests or those of our allies. So in the Cold War, there was a debate about, the older generation in the room will unfortunately remember Harold Brown's famous comment about the arms race with the Soviets. We build, they build, we stop, they build. What explains this? This was the late 1970s debate. And was it possible that that this wasn't just a system cranking out sausage, but that they actually had a theory of victory, that once they accomplished their modernization program, they would be confident that they could fight and win a nuclear war, or fight and win a major conventional war in Europe that they would win, and it wouldn't go nuclear because of their nuclear deterrent. And if they had a theory of victory, should we have a theory of victory? Should the Reagan buildup be more than just buying more and better triad, but something new and different in order to accomplish a particular theory of victory? Well, this debate raged through the Cold War, and the Cold War ended, and the debate was never settled. But I think this shorthand is a very nice way to think about what these three countries now have. They have a theory of victory. It's not a theory of victory in the sense of fighting and winning an all-out nuclear war. I don't see that any of them think that there's victory down that path. But bear in mind Clausewitz. Clausewitz thinks of war as a continuation of politics by other means. What does that imply for the meaning of the word victory? Victory is not that moment when you vanquish your enemy on the battlefield. Victory is that, quote, culminating point in a conflict where your adversary chooses to no longer run the costs and risk of continued conflict. It's a political point. And I think for these three actors, they've put in place theories of victory in the Clausewitzian sense, and that this guides their development of their capabilities, and it guides their understanding of conflict with the United States and its allies. But this isn't first and foremost or only a theory of victory in the spirit of Clausewitz. It's also and primarily in the spirit of Sun Tzu. None of these countries want to go to war with the United States. They've focused very much on how to create to exercise their military and political influence in their region in a manner that avoids direct military confrontation with us, comes right up to the brink, the gray zone problem, the conventional provocations of North Korea, Russia's repeated military assertiveness, but short of the conditions that create war with NATO, and salami slicing tactics, as we used to call them, to remake their regional security orders. Their confidence in their ability to stand up and fight war with America is what they're trying to convey, and principally to our allies, with the ambition of, over time, creating the circumstances where we are subdued, restrained, and deferential to their interests, and willing to remake the regional orders in a manner that they would prefer. So, theories of victory, red theories of victory in the spirit of both Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. What's the blue theory of victory? Well, clearly our innovation, the focus of our military innovation since 9/11 has been on counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. We haven't spent 20 to 30 years thinking about the problem of being the power that they seek to deter and defeat, that's a major power with nuclear weapons and allies. For many people in our community, the answer to my question is obvious in the question, which is to say, if China, Russia, and North Korea worry about deterring and defeating a conventionally superior nuclear armed major power and its allies, we must have all of the solutions in being the conventionally superior nuclear armed major power with a lot of allies. In other words, we have all of the strength that they fear, and our theory of victory should be, if they bring war to us, we'll trump them, because we have all the means to do so. Well, that's a very crude theory of victory, a very unreliable one, likely to be resisted by political leadership who will not readily choose to turn enemies into glass parking lots, and certainly unpromising in the Sun Tzu spirit. We don't have a lot of allies who are prepared to sign up to simply stand by while America holds the finger on the nuclear trigger in their neighborhood. So how do we think more deeply about what is required of us in meeting the challenge presented by these red theories of victory? Well, our usual starting point is to go to the vocabulary of deterrence, which I think only slightly gets us there. I like the Chinese term of art, counter-deterrence. Yes, the Chinese, what's their nuclear strategy? It's counter-deterrence, they say. Well, what do they mean? They mean that we, the United States, have a strategy to deter them by nuclear means when they want to do the right thing. So the objective of their strategy should be to counter our deterrence strategy so that they're able to do the right thing. What does that mean in this instance? I think it means stripping away the confidence that the leaderships of these three countries have in their ability to impose unbearable costs on us, their ability to protect themselves from unbearable costs, and their ability to understand the risks that go with conflict with the United States. I was deeply alarmed in a conversation with Alexei Arbatov. It was an on-the-record conversation, so I can report it. Arbatov will be known to some of you as one of the more thoughtful people in Moscow about nuclear strategy questions. And we were in a debate at a workshop on the future of nuclear arms control. My view was it's too early to tell. We'll see what happens in 2021. His view was it's done. Moscow's done with nuclear arms control. And there was a third participant in the discussion, David Holloway, the historian of the Soviet bomb, who said, I'm not quite sure why I'm here in this discussion on the future of arms control as an historian, but what I can say was in the Cold War there was a whole lot of nuclear learning done in Moscow. And that when Gorbachev stood with Reagan at Reykjavik and said, nuclear wars cannot be won and thus must not be fought, Gorbachev was actually speaking for the Soviet military and political elite, who took their World War II experience and said, never again will the Soviet people suffer this, and who took the scare of the Cuban Missile Crisis to heart. And Arbatov leapt in and said, now I understand the role of the historian in this discussion. It's to prompt me, Arbatov, to say, all that learning, gone. The generation now in charge in Moscow feels no connection to the World War II devastation, isn't interested in the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are a small group of 8 to 10 people who climbed to the top of the pile in the 1990s, who see themselves as wizards above the law, who are huge risk takers and feel rewarded by the risks they've taken, and look at you Americans as both dangerous and feckless, but certainly paper tigers. And in Arbatov's formulation, they are willing to accept all of the risks of nuclear war because they know you will back down. That's got to be the focus of our strategy. Taking away that confidence that they have, that they can calculate and accept the costs, and that they know what the risks are, and they're bearable risks. Nuclear war should be about unbearable risk. So I see a blue theory of victory, and by that I mean a blue-green theory of victory. That's to say U.S. and its allies. Our allies are the focus of these red theories of victory. It's very much in China, Russia, and North Korean interest to separate our allies from the United States and from each other, to impress upon them their vulnerability, to get them to exercise restraint on us. Extended deterrence is back in the middle of this discussion in the way it hasn't been for a long time. And thus, the theory of victory the United States should develop for this problem set has to be a theory of victory that we develop together with our allies. And I'd say that's actually a process quite far along. In Northeast Asia, we have dialogues with our Japanese and South Korean allies on strengthening and adapting deterrence to deal with 21st century challenges. And in the NATO context, since the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review of 2012 and the annexation of Crimea and the summit in Wales that summer, there's been a significant process since then to revise and adapt and strengthen NATO's conventional and nuclear posture to deal with new problems. But I think our core idea in our theory of victory has to be to strip away the confidence of these leaders that they're capable of executing those four things, that they can create a conventional fait accompli at low cost to them, and that's not a quagmire for them. This points to the value of tripwires and tire shredders in the Baltics. Secondly, we want to strip away their confidence that they can separate allies from the United States and each other. That has a lot to do with ballistic missile defense and with some independent strike capabilities for those allies. Thirdly, we want them to understand that their anti-access area denial strategies are going to be ineffective, that we're going to be able to penetrate through them and impose a lot of cost on them as well if they want to go there, including by conventional means, a gap that's significant in our posture. And lastly, if they want to cross the nuclear threshold, we're not prepared to tiptoe. We're not prepared to engage in tit-for-tat nuclear exchanges. We're not prepared to match Russia in providing a nuclear scalpel for every problem in Europe, as they put it, because we don't think crossing the nuclear threshold is a little deal. We think crossing the nuclear threshold is a big deal. And lastly, if they're prepared to contemplate the possibility of nuclear attack on the American homeland and to take the level of conflict from a regional one to a strategic conflict, we are prepared to defend our interests in that realm and capable of doing so, and that capability will not be stripped away by their actions in space or cyberspace. Which brings me to a closing argument on the blue theory of victory, which is it's not just a nuclear theory of victory or a theory of nuclear victory. This is an all-domain. This is the new regional strategic problem in front of us. All domain. Our adversaries, all three of those adversaries, write about using all of the tools available to them at all stages of conflict to shape our behavior and that of our allies. We think of this more linear ladder of escalation with nuclear at the top rung. And this doesn't match the way they think about it. And I have the impression that as we, the U.S. community interested in regional strategic conflict, grapple with these questions, we're sort of like the blind man and the elephant. I hope you know this metaphor, but you put a group of blind men together with an elephant and then ask them to describe the animal they've touched. And of course, if you've touched the big, soft, floppy ear, that tells you one sort of animal. If you found the trunk, that tells you another sort of animal. And our communities of space, nuclear, missile defense, conventional prompt global strike, the regional studies experts, these are all touching different parts of the elephant, but there is no common view of the elephant that's yet emerged. And I think our view of the elephant needs to be informed by the theory of victories that these countries have developed. We need to have our own theory of victory that guides us to acquire and demonstrate and the capabilities associated with our theory of victory. And we need to do this together with our allies. So that's the main set of arguments on theories of victory, red and blue, or red, blue, and green. I find a great deal of interest in this way of thinking about this problem because it kind of breaks us out of the different toolkits and looks at a strategic problem that clearly sits in front of us. And I thank you for your time and interest and engagement and look forward to comments, questions, or comments masquerading as questions.
I'm going to take the first question, Brad, if I could. Thank you, Nick. I'm going to do this from a budget is, what would be the things you would say don't do with respect to, let's say,
I think your mic's off.
But, for example, there are those who want to kill long strike options. Some people want to get rid of there it is. Some people want to get rid of the long-range strike options. Some people want to get either rid of or delay the ground-based strategic deterrent. Some people want to reduce the number of subs to 6. Some, like Joe Ciancione said, we don't need missile defense now in Europe because Iran doesn't have nuclear capability. It would solve that problem, as he said. So I'm looking at not only what we should do, but where are the things that, if we did, really would be the wrong things to do?
One of the comments in my book that's generated the least support from readers is that we have exactly the force structure we need. And the constant search for more to prune just flies in the face of this new problem set. I think it was perfectly necessary and appropriate in the period after the Cold War to move away from Cold War vintage forces and the concepts that guided them, but we didn't know what. Three presidents came in and said, I want to move away from Cold War thinking, without being very clear about what they wanted to move toward. I wanted to move away from something, but where did I want to head? And three presidents have talked about the importance of reducing. Well, one used the word reliance on nuclear weapons. One used the word the salience of nuclear weapons. The Obama administration used role and number. And I don't think we're going to hear this administration talk. I don't think we would have heard the Clinton administration talk about further reducing one of those nouns because we've moved into a different security environment. And we've, in that security environment, with the degree of uncertainty that prevails in it, the triad remains of value to us because of the flexibility it provides us to deal with a variety of possible problems. And the minimum capabilities now left in it are perhaps, they're adequate for the security environment that we can conceive, in which we exist today. But I think we're less confident than ever that if we're buying forces for 80 years, that exactly the mix and match of capabilities in the force today are those we're going to want over 80 years. And thus our posture must include the capacity to create different forces in the future. So I see the community interested in further pruning as missing the point in the security environment in which we live. And if you take my view as set out, that the principal nuclear deterrence problem in front of us isn't the strategic all-out global nuclear war problem, but a regional war problem, and that our allies are the focus of the strategies of these three actors, the capability it's extended deterrence that should be at the center of our attention, whereas we put most of our attention from the U.S. nuclear deterrence community on the strategic triad. What we want in the nuclear realm to meet the challenge of these regional red theories of victory is the ability to signal both our nuclear resolve and the resolve of our allies. It's not enough to signal America's nuclear resolve. This only reinforces the perception that our allies don't have nuclear resolve and thus are easy pickings in this strategy. Hence the important strategic value of dual capable aircraft, backed by the ability to deploy bombers with assured penetration capability of one kind or another. Those are assets that many people want to do away with in the name of greater efficiency, and I think they're the ones that are most relevant to the deterrence and assurance challenge we have in front of us. So that's a longer answer than you might have bargained for. Drew, hang on for the mic. We want to capture every word.
Drew Walter with the House Armed Services Committee. Following up on that, if the core center of gravity or theory of victory that we really need to get after is the mindset of foreign leaders for their confidence that we will back down and that we are feckless. And I'll be in my nuclear lane here. I know it's broader, but so I just spent yesterday evening on the House floor having debates about LRSO, GBSD, and $1 trillion over 30 years, and we don't need all of this. Let's just get rid of some of it. In our political system, which we're not willing to sacrifice, there's going to always be those questions and those doubts raised and those debates had. And even though, at least in my 7 years on the Hill, we've never made the wrong, in my mind, decision, those doubts always get raised, and we always have those debates. How does that impact those foreign leaders and their theory that we're feckless and that we'll back down and that we're going to just allow our deterrent to slowly rust?
Well, the short answer would be unhelpfully influence their thinking. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think our timidity as a national political leadership group in addressing the risks and challenges of the emerging security environment, as reflected in our timidity about investing for nuclear deterrence, it is a source of reassurance to them that we've lost our commitment to sustain and win a long-term competition with them. Thus, what we need to be is freely engaged in debates about nuclear weapons and willing and capable of articulating a politically persuasive case for the long-term investments that are needed. I take my experience in working with my Japanese colleagues, where we were advised early by political friends inside the Washington Beltway that nuclear dialogue with the government and expert community of Japan should be avoided because it's a taboo topic and you're opening a can of worms by having that discussion. Well, it reinforced the impression that we actually lacked conviction about our policies. We had the same experience in NATO. People said, don't come to Europe and talk about nuclear deterrence, because that will just open a can of worms. Well, the message that people took was, well, you don't think your arguments are going to stand up to public scrutiny. Well, we do believe our arguments stand up to public scrutiny. Buy my book. So I actually think that while Putin may take individual reports of debates in the American Congress and the body politic generally about nuclear modernization as reinforcing his general reading of the way American politics works, I think there's deterrence value in signaling our ability to debate afresh every year the benefits and drawbacks of different modernization pathways, because what the message conveyed over the long term is that there is bipartisan commitment to see this 30-year project through. Who'd like to go next? Please. Mike's coming to you.
My name is Dave Anhalt. I'm a private aerospace consultant. I like the way you formulated the red theory. It's 4 steps. And the first one is fait accompli. And it seems as though there may be a slippery slope of fait accompli happening right now. I'm thinking that every time the North Korean leader gets a more sophisticated rocket off the pad without any significant consequences, that's at least testing the water. Or mainland China building big aircraft carriers that look like islands is another one. Certainly Russia, no particular consequence aside from harming a little bit of economic interest there and taking over part of the Ukraine. It seems as though we're already experiencing a slippery slope towards the fait accompli. is it not very important for us then in trying to prioritize across conventional versus nuclear investments, of which there's a considerable amount of nuclear investment has to be made to kind of get ready for the future, because there's kind of like we're atrophying big time, right, because of its aging. Of all that, is it more important for us to make sure no conventional fait accompli can possibly occur, and thereby, you know, bolster our allies' confidence that we won't get to the nuclear stage because we can deny them the fait accompli, the real one that we're trying to prevent? Or am I thinking too linearly here? It would seem that your simple notion of this approach, and I don't mean it's simple because it's not sophisticated, I mean it's simple because it can be understood with a single sentence. It seems like the Achilles heel in Red's strategy is that they will never be allowed success on a fait accompli. And that can be conventionally determined, not nuclear determined, because I don't think your strategy calls for them to achieve their fait accompli with a nuclear weapon. They'll achieve their fait accompli with conventional weapons.
Right. But I don't see this as an either-or problem for us. It seems to me that the to stretch your argument a little bit, there's a community of people who believe that we have such conventional supremacy that we can put all of our eggs in that basket and defeat the fates accompli, or make them so impressively awful for those who would consider them that they'll never go there and we don't need to worry about the escalation end. That might have been the America of 1991. But then Saddam Hussein gave us 6 months to do it. The forces with which we did that to Iraq are mostly gone. Our ability to gain conventional supremacy requires months, if not even longer, and obliges us to accept significant risk in the regions from which we would draw forces to do that. Moreover, the conventional defense of the targets of the fait accompli cannot be conducted with 100% success. We can't protect Seoul from the artillery fire of North Korea. We can't send in ground forces to prevent 12 million people dying in Seoul in the course of 24 hours. We can't protect Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia by conventional military means. We can't protect Taiwan by keeping forces in Pearl Harbor. We can't do conventional defense of the fait accompli targets. What we can do is raise their expected costs and increase their expected timeline and increase their worry that they're entering a quagmire. And so I like the image that's been invoked at NATO. You know, there was a discussion about between Wales and Warsaw creating conventional tripwire forces on the model of the Berlin Brigade. The Berlin Brigade had the role during the Cold War of sitting in Berlin and waiting to die. There was no pretense that the Berlin Brigade was going to defend Berlin. Its job was to create the understanding among Soviet leadership that if there was war to take Berlin, enough Americans would die that America could not just stand by and say, oh, never mind.
And that was very important for Germany, too.
It was. But the tripwire, so there's a conventional tripwire now in the Baltics. This is the Rapid Reaction Force and the Very Rapid Reaction Force. And maybe what we've done is recall the RAND study of 3 years ago that said, well, recall Putin's boast that I can be in, was it 3 NATO capitals in 60 hours or something to that effect. If we can change his understanding to, well, that might be a 6-week project or a 6-month project. You know, Ukraine is a quagmire. He's paying a high continuing cost to do that. If we can create that understanding about the quagmires, then maybe they don't attempt. But we can't do conventional defense. And we can't really understand what their stake. I mean, I think Putin's stake in trying to break the NATO security order is very high. He has said so. His explanation for why he was entering Crimea was that that for too long he had extended the hand of friendship to the West, and that the United States and its allies had been pursuing instead a strategy of encirclement and containment. And like a spring compressed too long, at a certain point you have to snap back hard, and I start in Crimea. Well, what's next? So to me, we have to take a reading of their perceived stake in addition to our ability to raise their cost of their fait accompli strategy. And I think we cannot raise the cost sufficiently in our period of declining conventional dominance to escape the fact that they've prepared themselves for our escalatory actions when our conventional defense fails, and they're prepared to go there with the conviction that their employment of those means will induce our further restraint and not create further stake for us. That's a significant strategic miscalculation on their part, but I think it's one they all make.
I'm Hugh Gustafson from George Washington University, and I'm wondering if North Korea belongs in the same category with Russia and China. Russia and China are major global powers. They're expansionary powers with ambitions of regional dominance. North Korea seems to be in more of a defensive crouch, trying to protect its own regime, and it's a client state of China. A month ago, I heard a talk by former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, in which he argued that while it was probably too late to completely roll back North Korea's nuclear program, he thought that it would be possible still to effect a grand bargain with North Korea where they would freeze their nuclear capability in exchange for various kinds of assurances of security. So I'm wondering what you think of Bill Perry's suggestion and whether North Korea is really in the same league as these other two countries and is behaving the same way.
Well, I think it's a fair point, and my red theory of victory is a bumper sticker version of three different strategies that have a lot of similarities, but of course many important differences. But I'm not sure that I have the confidence you appear to have, or at least conveyed in your bumper sticker, about North Korean strategy. It may be a porcupine state, just don't mess with me and everything will be fine. On the other hand, it's got 50 years of history of attempting to kill the cabinet of the government of South Korea, of one provocation after another. It's difficult for me to imagine that this 32-year-old man, whatever he is these days, envisions at the end of his 60 years in government, passing on to his son or grandson the current division on the peninsula. It is a revisionist power. It seeks to, what it sees is restore Korean sovereignty under a legitimate political model. It sees itself as the legitimate heir to the long-term historical governance structure on the peninsula. And his vision is clearly the ejection of U.S. influence in the region. And it may be a client state of China, but it's an odd client-state relationship because the Chinese clearly fear being drawn into a war that the North Koreans might instigate. And if war came, it's not at all clear to me that China would be on North Korea's side, so to speak. I hope Bill Perry is right. It's certainly worth a trial run. A JCPOA for North Korea would be an interesting proposition. But that option's been on the table all along. And I don't see what sign there is today. And I know that Dr. Perry sees signs, and I just don't see them. And the argument is that the strategic patience of the Obama administration caused a number of windows of opportunity to close that were in fact wide open for us to seek accommodation with North Korea. But when pressed, what were those windows? What were those signs? I never find persuasive evidence that they're there. I think it's difficult to imagine the circumstance in which the North Korean leadership, having paid such a price to get where it's gotten, with now its own small nuclear force right within reach, to say, oh, never mind, we're going to stop here. They've not chosen to stop with a latent posture. They've chosen to cross the threshold and move forward. So frankly, I'm skeptical. But that's not to say it's not worth taking a run, because we'd certainly like to escape the necessity of coming into a deterrence relationship with North Korea beyond the kind we already have. Any final comments, questions, quarrels? No? Well, thank you all for your time and interest. Thank you for turning out in the heat and humidity.
Well done, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
I think Dr. Perry's